because I'm not looking at the screen.
Bastards.
You fucking bitch.
All attention should be on me.
Put this to me.
Oh shit. That's what I want to think about right now. Welcome back, you beautiful bastards, to another week. This week's guest is Jeffrey Lee. Jerry, why don't you tell us about Jeff?
Jeff's a cool dude, man. We already talked to him, as you guys have noticed our new format. He is a well-traveled individual who happens to be Asian. And that's kind of a big part of the topic today, is Asian hate. People like Grizz and myself, your average white guy, didn't really understand the things that were going on with this because, for one, we don't hate Asians. So it's hard for us to grasp that concept. But he is actually an anti-Asian hate activist, among many other things. But he's a fantastic person. He's a great guy to talk to. And I think you guys are going to like this episode.
Yeah, it was a good conversation. We kind of went all over the place a little bit, but, we come back around again.
Yeah, but definitely well worth the listen. Sit through all of Andy's bullshit, and you'll piece something out of it. Yeah. So let's check it out. All right, Jeff, thanks for being on the show. How's it going?
It's going great here. Thanks for having me. I think we're expecting like 97 degrees today in DC. So I can't say August is the best time to be in the nation's capital. But it's clear skies and idyllic otherwise, despite the little touch of despair in the air.
Yeah, that's a little bit of everywhere. Actually, Connecticut, our weather's been just weird. It feels like Washington. It's raining every other day, and it's not really as hot as it usually is. It's the strangest thing. But that's climate change for you. But, we're not... Go ahead.
I was going to say, it could be more challenging. I mean, you hear about what's going on with fires in the Western states, and it's, the new normal, right? It's rather alarming.
It's a yearly thing now. Every year, rebuild your house. It's a good time.
Yeah. When I worked I was working in California, in the governor's office, and one of the craziest things was, when you respond to fires, you get people who, lose everything. And then a year later, you come back and they've lost everything again, rebuild in the same spot.
Yeah.
So it's a little Groundhog's Day, but it ain't groundhogs that you're worried about. It's many other things.
Yeah, that one, it's always blown my mind. I've never understood it, but okay. I mean.
Yeah, we just recently did an episode on that, talking about, we're getting a lot more extremes globally, but in the United States specifically for our purposes. And the big thing on that episode was they keep rebuilding exactly the same and in the exact same place. And it's not making any sense, but they still do it.
They say, history history doesn't repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme. Right. And I think that is the case. To your point, Andy, I think it's home for people. Like, home is home. And the thinking that you would leave your home, especially not on your own terms, doesn't feel right either. So there's sort of a test of sort of human character and being stubborn to sort of stick to the lands, especially if you have a multiple generational connection, but it is a little shocking if you think about it.
The other thing we found out with that episode is it had a lot to do with the fact that when the insurance payout came, they couldn't build up to a standard that would have withstood what devastated them in the first place. And then on top of that, they already own that plot of land, so they're just going to build there again. Why would they sell that, which is now worth nothing, and go build somewhere else?
That's right. And, you will find a time where fire insurance will be as terrible as flood insurance, right? It will be sort of an equivalent, if not worse. Expect to see that in the next couple of years, especially as we have record drought and record fires again, right?
It's starting to become that car insurance is the only one that kind of makes sense right now.
I don't know. Life insurance could be interesting, but that's a little more of a morbid perspective.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
So, Jeff, you said you're in DC, right?
Yep. I've been based here in DC for the last 3 years.
And what is it you're doing down there?
Yeah. So, today I'm working at a fintech startup called Rhino, which is working in the insurance and housing space. What the company is trying to do is provide options for renters, right? There's about 110 million renters in the US, a third of the country. And one of the things that I found pretty shocking is just how much upfront cost renters have, right? So let's just say you wanted to rent in some shiny building somewhere in town, right? You would have, a application fee, there'd be a pet fee, there'd be an amenity fee, first month's rent, last month's rent, and then the security deposit. And then a security deposit is usually 1 month's rent, maybe more. And you have two options when it comes to this. Option one, pay all of it and live there. And two, don't pay it and you don't live there. And that might be fine for some of you who have options, but 40% of Americans have about $450 in savings. So think about it, right? We have, right now we're in this weird place with this COVID-19 eviction moratorium, right? Public health crisis. Eventually the courts will strike it down. And you'll probably have about 3.5 million people that will be evicted from their homes in the next 60 to 90 days. That's if they're lucky, right? Maybe the courts will step in quicker. Who knows? So, But one of the things that...
go on.
No, I was going to say, but one of the things that I'm trying to do, right, is provide a different option for security deposits. So, Andy, let's say you want to rent a place and it's $2,000 a month. You don't have $2,000 of security deposit money laying around, right? And instead of paying $2,000, you pay my company, Rhino, a premium of $20 a month. And you pay that for the duration of the contract. So let's say 12 months. So 12 times 20, $240. You pay $240, you don't get that back. But when you pay your rent on time to your landlord, and when you don't leave a giant hole in the wall, you're good. And so when you leave, you're solid. And we act as the guarantor for the landlord, because what does the landlord want? They want a guarantee. So we act as the guarantor. If there's shenanigans that happen or there's a disputed claim, they file with us directly and we assess the veracity, right? And if something happens and it's valid and true, then we have to, obviously, look at other options with the renter. But generally speaking, we're trying to provide people options. Like think about in healthcare, right? When you have to start a job, right? You've got the giant form, the applications, and you have all these plans. And then you do your due diligence, you see what's good for you and your family. You're a grown up, you pick one. But in renting, it's either you pay this or you don't. And that is your option. And we're trying to provide more choice in this space. We think it's good for the consumer. We think it's good for the landlord who just wants a guarantee. And if you think about folks who are, come from a single family home or want to spend their money on, kids' summer camp or other things, you have more flexibility than you would have before. So that's sort of what I'm working on. I lead public policy across 50 states and Congress, which is really fun. Housing is an important issue. It's one of the most complex. So that's what I'm working on today right now, to answer your question.
On the eviction, I haven't had to look into that at all. How are they doing that? Are they doing that so basically if you're not paying your rent right now, you're all right, but when it gets cut off, are people having to pay that back? Are they not? Because I gotta imagine if they don't have to pay that back, what's going to stop the landlord from just cutting ties and being like, peace, we'll see you later?
Yeah. So the country's had a eviction moratorium from the Centers for Disease Control, right, for public health reasons, really since last spring. And so what that's meant is that people haven't had to pay, but you could be evicted in some states for other reasons, like noise complaints or doing illegal things, right? But let's say you weren't paying for the duration, right? Congress passed, in the big sort of bills that they passed a large scale, like $350 million, program. Well, that's for DC, but they passed a multi-billion-dollar program of money that went to all 50 state governments and DC and a few other states. And they were trying to push rental assistance money. So this is direct money that would pay for arrears rent to landlords. And that was actually to the point where landlords could apply for the money so they could get it directly, right? The problem was only like 6.5% of that money was actually reaching the people. That's bad.
Yeah, that is bad.
Do we know where the rest of it went?
So most of it is stuck in bureaucracy because one of the challenges is that the most states require, and understandably so, you need to be able to assess like what your income hit was. So one of the litmus tests is if your income was negatively affected by COVID-19. So you need to at least have like a pay stub or something, or show you're out of work. So you have to have some sort of, formal paperwork. But all the government IT systems are a little dilapidated, right? Maybe English isn't your first language. Or worse, this is the case, the vast majority of Americans don't even know these services are provided. There's over 500 programs for rental assistance in the country right now. Not everybody knows about them. Like in Connecticut and Rhode Island, where you all are, I don't think everybody knows about it. But think about it, right? This affects the the renter, but also affects the mom and pop landlords, right? So folks who own a couple units, but they've been on the hook this whole time for, their construction issues or obligations, taxes, utilities, these other issues, and that's about 22 million people that are affected. So, the government and others were sort of in a rock and a hard place, right? And unfortunately, there's been such a push now to try to get that money to people. But unfortunately, some of the systems aren't designed to get to people quickly. And, most of this money turns into a pumpkin at the end of September. So there's like this real race. It's pretty bad. And so these are things I think about, and these are everybody issues. This is going to affect many Americans across the country, but think about it, right? Let's just say people get evicted and then they try to move somewhere else, right? What do you think their credit score looks like?
They won't be able to.
It's a real problem, right? So there's all these sort of issues that I'm seeing, and that's what's keeping me up at night, right? I think about how can we support these communities, and this is, most of these folks have had, these challenges through no fault of their own, right? It's not their fault they got laid off because the whole world, basically cratered, and it's rather unfortunate. You're going to have millions of people that will be living in, terms that are more poverty stricken than they did before the pandemic. And the pandemic did a lot of things, which was highlight the haves and have-nots very quickly.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And it actually created a bigger divide there as well. What I found interesting was at the beginning of the pandemic, I didn't get laid off. My hours cut back, so I made less money, but I didn't lose my job. But I called my mortgage company before it all went crazy. And I said, hey, if I get laid off, what are my choices? And they really only gave me one, which was forbearance. Yep. And essentially what that means is you don't have to pay anything until you have to pay it all. Mm-hmm. And so I said to them, well, if I don't have it now, I'm not going to have it then. So what's going to happen? And they're actually, what really bothered me was their response was their shareholders won't allow them to do anything else. And that's a serious problem if your shareholders are deciding that everybody in America can get evicted or foreclosed because they want their money now.
Yeah. Now the government is trying to respond to some of this, right? There's a infrastructure package that, has recently passed through Congress. It hasn't really addressed housing per se. It's addressed many other infrastructure issues, which is good.
Actually, Grizz and I were looking at that bill earlier today, this afternoon, going over
2,702 pages.
It's
housing's not on there.
There's not 1 ounce of it.
No.
And it's largely because that anything dealing with housing is going to go towards the $3.5 trillion plan that the Democrats are going to be trying to push, which will be very challenging because everybody knows this is the only game in town, right? So imagine you only have one way to get to town. Everyone wants to hop in, right? No one wants to walk. There's going to be a lot of stuff hopping in the car. And here's the thing. What happens when you have too much stuff in the car? The bottom of your car bottoms out, right? I think they're going to have some challenges. They're going to have to cut some weight or get some more wheels. It's going to be a real challenge, though.
It's always interesting the things they throw in there.
Yeah, but they're going to have to pass it with reconciliation, which means all of the Democrats have to say yes. And at present, they don't even have that. Not dependably anyway.
Yeah, in the Democratic caucus, right? It's a big tent party because right or wrong, we have a two-party system. So a lot of folks join the club, right? And they represent a wide spectrum. And, in the U.S. Senate, absolutely, you've got 50 people who have very different perspectives on what should go in there. And the House of Representatives, there are people that are, far more left than the Senate Democrats are. So it's a bit of a seesaw, right? How do you sort of have a party that, that can really support an Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, but also support a Joe Manchin at the same time? It's this will be a real test of sort of what keeps people together and understanding. And this is the big thing, that passing something is the win, but what's inside of it will determine what these groups feel, did they get what they needed or deserved, right? Some Democrats will say that 3.5 trillion is probably too small. Right?
Oh, I guarantee.
Yeah. And some will say, like they do in the Senate, that it's too much. And so at some point, the public at the end of the day aren't going to go through the 2,700 pages, but likely more for this one, like you all did. And they will just be judging it based on did the president sign it or not? If the president signs it, that's something, right?
Yeah, and so actually going over the bill today, even if I knew a lot of people who read it, I'm really confident that there's a lot of people that wouldn't understand it anyway because of the way that it's written.
No, not at all. I mean, we made it. I mean, we were just glancing at it. We made it, 30, 50 pages in, and that was, most of it was just right by.
Yeah, I think y'all are gluttons for pain. Unless you're having a hard time sleeping and you didn't want to count sheep. Yeah, reading clauses of shall and may.
Oh my
and
God,
might.
it's brutal.
It's brutal. And, the devil is in the detail, though, Andy, because how things are paid for is really the sticking point for most of this. Not necessarily, I think we all agree we should have clean water, right? We all agree that we should have roads that actually work. These things are good for human rights. It's also good for business, right? Everyone gets that. Nobody can agree on how it gets paid for. And that's the big challenge. And that's where I think the Democratic caucus is going to have a real tough time. And imagine you're the Republicans, right? Even if it's good ideas, it's not necessarily your number one interest to give the other opponents a win. Right.
Yeah.
Even if it has stuff that you like, not necessarily a win. Now, again, to the points you both made, if the Democrats just all stick together and agree in principle on something to the finish line, they don't need a single Republican. That's pretty interesting. But
it has made things kind of wonky.
Very much so. Yeah. But that's what makes it, unfortunately, and then you add the 24-hour media cycle. It can be a little painful. Right. The talking heads that float around and they get their little jab in, and divisiveness creates clicks.
Yeah, that's what runs the whole thing now is just it's all about clicks and advertising space, which is it's a terrible way to run a country. And we can see it actively in real time burning to the ground, but we're still doing it because that's the American way. We stick to things until we can't anymore.
The truth is, if the news were boring, no one would read it. Right.
Yeah.
That's part of it. I was just thinking about this. I don't know if you all saw. Did you all catch the Olympics these last 2 weeks?
I didn't watch a single second.
Neither did I.
Yeah. Why do you think that is?
We're younger generation. I could care less.
Yeah. I would argue, first off, ratings were pretty low. Right.
Yeah.
But I would argue two things. One, people are a little sad. Like they don't want to really see these events. It's even as an escape, there's better ways to escape, right? Netflix and all that stuff. But I would argue the second reason why nobody really cared in the way you would think is because we care about the stories of people going through hard things. And for whatever reason, there wasn't enough build to learn about people. Because it's not that you care about the javelin, but you care about the person who you're rooting for, who has an amazing story, who's getting there, who's going to win for our country. That's the amazing part, right? That part I always get emotional about. It's not like, wow, they ran faster than anybody else. That's really cool. But when you hear a story of a multi-time Olympian who has, had to overcome significant adversity and the loss of someone important in their life, or that's what attracts things beyond the click things that we were just talking about. I think that human spirit part is interesting. And unfortunately, because of events out of our control, there just wasn't the same dedication to those stories.
It felt incredibly short. Granted, I didn't watch it, right? But I knew when it was happening. And I remember them being closing ceremonies. I was like, yeah, that happened really quick.
2 weeks.
And it's interesting that you mentioned too, not being invested in the athletes, because, you think about people like Usain Bolt or Michael Phelps, and those are the last Olympians that I can remember. And then even going back into the 90s, that's a good point. It's story based. It's not just the sport itself. And thinking about this year, the only person that I know of is Simone, because she was in the news for taking a day off. Yeah. Other than that, I have no idea who any of the athletes were.
Well, there was that Belarusian athlete that needed
to claim asylum. Yeah. Because
but that was post-event, so they didn't build us up to that.
Yeah, no, of course. Well, it was interesting on the Simone Biles part, right? One of the one of the consequences of that was it allowed for an 18-year-old out of St. Paul, right, Suni Lee, to win the gold all around. And, she's Hmong American, and, there've never been one of those in competition. And if you see the videos of her entire family, watching her win a gold medal she wasn't supposed to win, 18 years old. Okay. She's going to Auburn next year. She's going to Auburn in 3 months, freshman. Her dad, was paralyzed from falling off a ladder, supported her entire career, built her first balance beam, right? Like, if you hear that, that's amazing. And to do it in that event, the all around, again, gymnastics is not something we talk about every year. It's an every 4-year thing, but that's an incredible opportunity. And obviously you can imagine what that win meant for not just her, but this community of people that basically have been, without a country, now live in America, right? Since the late 70s. If you Google it, the city of St. Paul threw her a parade, and that's something that you wouldn't expect, right? For gymnasts. But I think what she meant for not just her community, but her state and her country, I think that's a pretty interesting thing.
But I also think that right now, a lot of the mainstream entertainment, we'll call it, is kind of fallen on its face. The Olympics didn't do as good. If you look at the movies that are coming out right now, they're flopping. I have no clue what the streaming numbers are. I'm sure they're perfectly fine. We'd hear otherwise. But I just think people are tired of it. The world is literally on fire right now.
Yeah, I don't know if it's the entertainment people are tired of, Grizz, but if you look throughout the last, 4 decades, the entertainment that people consume kind of reflects the state of the country, especially, in the United States, because that's the country that I live in, so that's what I know. But the mood kind of dictates how that's all received. And right now, just like Jeff is saying, it's completely terrible. The mood is horrible here.
Well, that's what I mean. Just throughout the world right now is just, again and again, you're just seeing everyone's just going, what the hell is going on? We're all just sitting there like wide-eyed, like, what happened here? And it's not going to get better, especially like we were talking about with the housing stuff. Like, it's just going to get worse. And, we just saw the housing market, it just got to its peak, and it seems like we're coming on the other side of that end where now, the housing prices are going down again. I'm interested to see where this goes.
Now, that being said, though, Jeff, you seem to have a more hopeful outlook, because I guess you kind of advocate people getting more involved, right?
Yeah, hopeful. I guess I try not to be blindly optimistic, but the thing I do believe in is that when you have more people involved, talking about things they actually care about and actually doing something, having conversations with people in their lives, I do think that's a good thing. Because I think when one of the challenges we were just talking about is polarization, right? And it's partly because we sort of hide in our own little bubbles, right? And particularly when you think about, issues of fairness, you think about, issues of the new economy, right? You think about people that the haves and have-nots, right? You've got CEOs making like an infinite amount more money than the lowest wage worker, right? The demands that puts on families that you could be working 40, 60, 80 hours a week and still struggle to pay rent. That's a real challenge, right? And so there is this need to sort of think bigger, but to really have, to really get the ideas to think bigger, you need people to actually talk to each other. And what I tell folks, particularly, in the issues I really care about beyond housing, right? When I think about, Asian American and Pacific Islander rights, or just, acknowledging their people, the hardest thing from what I've seen from people is to have a conversation with someone who they actually love. That is the hardest. It's amazing how easy it is to have a conversation with a stranger on the airplane, or, when you're sitting on a bench, right, and talking about what's going on in the world. But there's something about like the table stakes of like having that conversation with your uncle. It has a very different worldview than you, have had very different life experiences, right? Maybe a different education. That's like a really tough discussion, but it's really important because that divide is forcing people into artificial corners rather than getting people into a place where they can actually converse and understand that just because they disagree on ideas doesn't make anybody more or less superior, right? It's just that you have a different point of view. I think the hard part, and this is an American trait, unfortunately, is that we need to do a better job just being quiet and listening to, right? So it's like having the conversation, but letting people talk. Hear their perspectives, right? That's something that I think about certainly when people ask me, right? When people say, hey, Jeff, this Asian hate thing, that's not true. Like, that's not real. And you know what I point to them? I tell them a story. So just about, this is early July. Okay. I was coming out of the work meeting. So suit and tie, unfortunately, it's DC, it's hot, coming out. And I have two guys show up to me. They come up and they're like, hey, Buddha, would you mind if I rub your belly for good luck? And here's the thing. I've answered this question before. So I already have an answer for them. And my answer is this. I say, hey, just want you to know, I'm not a genie. So if you rub my belly, you don't get any wishes. You might want to save that for later. Right? And they're like, oh, yeah, okay. That makes sense. And a few more awkward moments and they leave. Right?
Yeah.
But here's the thing. I'm looking around. There's a police officer there. There's a couple other people see the whole thing happen. Nobody cares.
Yeah.
Just nobody cares. It's totally normal. A couple days ago, two things happened, right? Notable soccer team in Italy, Juventus, which is one of the largest teams. They, one of their players puts out a video of them wearing a cone that makes it look like a race hat. And then they do the little slanty eye thing. Okay, you know what? Europeans, it happens. Maybe that's the case. NFL player, Green Bay Packers, today, or not today, a few days ago, says, hey, I want to see your eyes because it's chinky, That's just in the last couple of days. Yeah. So, this is August of 2021. So you tell me, these things that you see in your daily life, like this thing is like, we need to call to it because the truth is when you let this stuff go, then the really not so good stuff, like when I got spit on in an airport, which we talk about, that becomes normal. Right. Yeah. And one of the challenges of the pandemic is there have been scapegoating against folks. And I've certainly had multiple experiences, my parents have as well, of being called the reason why the virus is here. So I think that's a new phenomenon. At the same time, it's an old phenomenon because anti-Asian foreignness or xenophobia has been around for a while.
Now, do you think that COVID has kind of ramped up the incidences of this happening? Because so for us, we, our experience where we live, and maybe we just haven't noticed it because we're not necessarily directly affected, but the stuff that we see on the news versus what we see in our real life there's a huge difference there. So yeah, that's what I was wondering about.
Yeah, I think two things. One is I think the instances have increased. If you just look at hate crime data, this is self-reported, right? In California, hate crime against Asian Americans have gone up over 106%. Right. So that is definitely a spike. Now, hate crime in general in the state, for example, has gone up over almost 40, right? And a group called Stop AAPI Hate had over 6,600 instances of, acts of violence or hate or xenophobia. That's self-reported, though. The true number is far larger. That's largely because of English language. That's also because of cultural reasons and also, let's say, shame. So you put those things in there. So on the one hand, there's more touch points and in a 24-hour cycle of news world and, cameras on your phone, you probably saw videos of grandmas basically being beaten up on the street. When I see those videos, yes, like what is happening is horrible. The thing that I noticed, though, is all the people watching. Like people are standing there letting that happen. That's the thing that really is unnerving, that bystanderism. Like that thing is the killer. The second instance is that, so on the one hand, right, it is increasing because I think there's more opportunity to do so. And then the second thing is there's more reason to scapegoat, right? So you sort of see those two polar reasons happening. But that's not just the stuff you see on TV. That's also the everyday stuff, like I was telling you. But I'll give you a more tangible example. Where you've got, as we were coming out of this COVID-19 thing, you had small businesses trying to come back, right? Since things were becoming more consistent, people got these PPP loans. So all the small businesses were coming back, except for a lot of the Asian businesses were using their money, the last bits of their money to deal with vandalism. So we saw a spike in vandalism in like Asian restaurants or Asian laundromats or nail salons across the country. So you can imagine it must be pretty hard to get your business back in order when you've got a giant hole through the window and you're just starting to serve people again, right? So those are like real tangible. So as the world was sort of reopening for a little bit, like you had a lot of groups still sort of living in this realization that actually they were maybe less safe because of these opportunities.
I know around me that either whether it be a restaurant, an Asian restaurant, or just a business owned by Asians, that when we went in either during or towards, I mean, it's not over, so I can't say that, during the pandemic, like they were much more thankful that we were in there than a normal, like every day, like we went in there and it was like, and you started to look around and realize the numbers are way down, which granted at the time I thought, okay, it's a pandemic. People aren't going out. Right. Yeah. But then you start to realize when you go into other stores, no, people are avoiding it. It's like, it doesn't make any damn sense to me. Wherever this thing started, it doesn't, why does that affect anyone who's over here or in Europe or wherever? It doesn't make any sense to me. But then again, the racism never makes any sense to me. So
no, it unfortunately hasn't. And you've had 650,000 people die.
Yeah.
Think about that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's like entire cities that so just give you context. DC is 690,000 people. So basically it's the entire nation's capital just disappeared. Mm-hmm. So think of it like that, like a whole city of consequence just disappeared. That's pretty interesting. And, I've always viewed, this as a war against, it'd be like you and I fighting a fire or fighting a flood or fighting a cybersecurity attack. I have felt that way. It's a major disaster, right? Disaster response. But we have many folks in this country that don't want to embrace it as that issue. They sort of embrace it as an infringement on liberty. And that's like just hugely challenging, especially when we already have a polarized country as it is. Right. Yeah. So, for Asian groups, unfortunately, you had the twin sort of dangers, right? You had the danger of catching COVID-19 and dying. And then you had the danger of racism and dying. Right. So what happens, and think about this is something I recently wrote about, think about, elder senior Asians, right? They understand that if they go outside and they're using public transit, that's where they're most vulnerable. So they stay in their house. Well, isolation is not exactly good for mental health. No. And then think about these groups that don't want to go outside. I mean, let's say they want to get the vaccine, right? Let's just say they did. They're probably less likely to, if they're afraid to go outside. So I would call it something like sheltering in fear. And that's something that unfortunately we're seeing. So, and it's August, we should be walking around going on vacation. And you've got folks here who are too scared to go outside because they've heard enough stories where people are being beaten up. And that's not just seniors. Like that's also, women and younger people too. I'll give you a quick example. I'm on a WhatsApp chat, about 50 young professionals, and they go into exceeding detail of what is the best pepper spray to use. Is it, the type of handle? Is it the spray radius? Can you put it onto a chain? Can you add a knife to it? Is there a siren or a light? How's the grip? Can you use it as a weapon too? Can you punch someone? And it's just going on and on and on. And everyone's like, oh yeah, I found this one to be not good. You should try this brand. So people have tested multiple brands.
This is all Asians?
These are all Asians.
Oh, God.
These are all Asians. And I would say average age 35. So, these are folks in, pretty good health and, can feel like they walk around, but everybody knows someone that got beat up or harassed or something, right? Right. I mean, part of the reason why I got into talking about these issues, last March, I was flying for my tech job, and a woman comes up to me in the airport and hawks a big giant loogie on my face.
Nice.
And she says, you should go back to where you come from. And I don't think she means like California or Georgia where I have family ties. I think she means somewhere else, right? I mean, never mind that, Vietnamese have a more complicated history with the Chinese, but that's neither here nor there. But again, like we were talking about bystanders, I take a look around, I make a joke because that's what you do to blend in, right? So I made a joke. I said something like, well, I should have brought my umbrella if I knew it was going to rain that day. Yeah. And I looked around and there were about a dozen people. They're already walking away. Saw what happened. Not even care.
It seems to be the world nowadays, and I'm not trying to put down racism, but I'm just saying, like, in all forms, like if there are people who need help and everything, more often, I remember when we were kids, you'd see someone pull over on the side of the road. Yeah. You'd pull over and see if they're all right. Now you buzz right by them going 80 and don't even bat an eye. Like, what is it that we've changed in the world where we're not willing to help out another human being? Especially if obviously it's one that's under distress,
Yeah, I think a part of it is the blessing and curse of individualism. I think there was a time, where people believed in sort of a collective. I think that's changed, unfortunately. I think some of it's stories too that people hear of, like, you help somebody and then you get screwed. I think you would hear those anecdotal stories,
which I blame on the media.
Yeah, which partly that. I think partly just sort of culture in general. But I think fundamentally people have just adopted this sort of survival mechanism, which is like, if it doesn't affect me, it's not my problem, right? But what I've learned is, like, there are bad people out there, but when bad people win, when good people don't want to do anything, that's where you're in trouble, right? And you can look at many parts of history, including World War II, including of others, where good people sort of go along with certain things. And that becomes a majority, right? And I think we're unfortunately in a place where that might be a potential symptom for bad things to come. Now, it's not all gloom and doom, right? I mean, we've also had more people come together talking about these issues. You have folks who, because of our digital technology, where the three of us can talk, right? So there's some silver linings, right? Where we can have ideas that could spread to others, and hopefully we can influence and have a fun conversation. So people go, oh yeah, I can understand how these Asian folks are treated like garbage. Maybe I should sort of acknowledge that they're not, they're not garbage, or maybe they're also not white either, depending who you're talking to, right? And one of the most awkward conversations I have, especially when I write pieces, a lot of the respondents I get from my pieces are other Asians who will write, and they are just so convinced that they've never experienced anything in their life negatively. And I'm like, are you sure? Like, do you want to take a look? Like, how many times have you been passed over for promotion because you don't have leadership skills? Or how many times have people told you your English is really good? How many times, right? And that's where, like, it kind of cuts them a little. And it's that sort of naivete. And I think, like anything, like, in our lives, you don't really want to acknowledge the thing that's right under your nose, because if you do, it forces you to do something different. And I think that's really hard for people.
Yeah, I've actually kind of seen this evolution myself. Now that we're talking about it, it's kind of changed my perspective on some interactions that I've had, because I'm a people person. So typically when I meet somebody, I'll ask them questions beyond, like, how's the weather today? And especially people from out.
How's the weather today?
It's terrible. It's humid and cloudy. It doesn't even make any sense. It's horrible outside. So one thing that I typically do is, if I know someone is from a different country, which is typically pretty obvious no matter where you're from, I'll ask them where they're from. And maybe 15 years ago, maybe a little less than that, I typically, especially from Asian people, would get a response of like, I'm like Korean or something like that. And maybe I'd say 2010-ish, that started to change to where they were from in the United States, even though you don't speak English very well, and it's obvious. So you're not from Brooklyn. That's not what I meant. But then, it's obvious that discomfort was growing because I can't remember this guy's name because I'm not very good with Asian names. He said he was from Brooklyn and his name was Bob, but he looked visibly uncomfortable when I asked him that. Yeah. And it didn't really dawn on me that he was concerned that I had a problem with him, when I was really just interested in where he was from.
Yeah. And
so that actually evolved to a point now where most of the time I don't ask that question because it's clearly uncomfortable for them.
Yeah. And it's unfortunate too, but you have to understand there are folks that will hear stories of someone saying, where are you from? They'll answer the question, they'll get punched in the face. Right. So that's what they're
I kind of made that connection too. I understand where their concern was from, but that's why I said, now that you mentioned it, I have kind of actively seen that change over the last 10 or 15 years. And it's interesting that, subconsciously, I noticed it, so I stopped asking that question. But it's not something that I had really given a lot of thought to.
Yeah, I'll say this: one of the challenges of being Asian American in this country is, there's a degree of foreignness. Like, regardless of how long you've been here, you're not really from here. And I think maybe that's the case with, I would say other groups might have some of that, other groups might not, right? Just depending on history and legacy. But I always tell friends, and I remind them that there are some Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans that were here in the 19th century that have been here. Their families have been here longer than most European Americans.
Yeah.
Right. Like, think if you're Irish, right? Your family came over during, the famines or something, right? Well, Chinese and Japanese were here before that. So it's like a pretty interesting concept if you think about it, right? Even though Asian Americans as a group is only about 7% of the country, it's the fastest growing, though. And as you all know, Asian American, that's 50 different groups with 100 different languages, right? So it's a very different group of people, right? It's pretty diverse and broad. It's sort of like if, you said, hey, you're Czech or you're Slovenian or German, right? Like, we just know they're all European, but you also know they're Slovenian or they're German or Italian, right? But if I say, hey, I'm from Laos, or hey, I'm from Burma, it doesn't register the same way, right? The connection is different. But it doesn't change the fact that, these terms are sort of blanket terms for other communities of folks who, maybe don't get the same amount of attention or haven't had the same experiences, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that because, their perspective is kind of different. I'm obviously white, and I have a lot of these conversations with people off the air. And I was talking to a guy who was black, and I was asking him about the whole terminology about African American, because I know a lot of black people who are not African at all. They're from like Jamaica or someplace like that. And so then what really surprised me was he asked me what I was, referring to my race. And it's not something I'd ever thought about before because I just called myself white. Yeah. And from his perspective, he thought I was Italian, which I am. And he didn't really view that as white. So it's interesting that being from a European country, it didn't really matter where it was from to me. I was just white. But it's significantly culturally different, especially with Asian countries. Yeah.
Well, just remember in the 19th century, right, you had Irish or Polish or other Europeans that were not considered white either. Yeah. Right. So there's an interesting twist, right? And here's the thing. If you look at, unfortunately, American history, there's always a point to sort of make the other, right? Yeah. Even if physically or biologically there's not that much difference, you sort of heighten the difference, right? Yeah. It's just in this case, obviously, there are certain characteristics you can kind of see more so. But I think that point is interesting. Like, being of Mediterranean heritage, like, could mean a lot of different things to other folks. But, to a black person, they clearly see the distinction. But imagine the world they're in, right? Their world is all about trying to get by distinction.
Yeah.
Right.
I've always found it. I grew up in New England, same with Jerry, and the first time I came into across racism was much later in life because you just don't see it up here nearly as much. But I just always thought of everyone as a mutt. If nowadays, besides a select few, who's not mixed in some sort of way, and why do we give a shit?
Yeah, well, it's a good point. Here's the thing, race issues at the end of the day are social constructs, right? Mm-hmm. But for most, I would say, people of color, they experience difference pretty much at a young age. For me, I'll tell you this story. For me, like, when I experienced my first moment of racism, and you have to understand, like, I love baseball, I love apple pie, I want to be an astronaut, right? In my mind, I'm American as it gets, right? Mm-hmm. Now, my parents are both people from Vietnam who fled the war and were on a boat for 6 years and landed in America. They had nothing, right? Their experience is very different than mine, right? And what I've learned is, especially with more time, is that, the American dream is the dream for your kids to have the things you never had. Right. Mm-hmm. So I think for many immigrants, that's like a unifier, regardless of what you look like. Mm-hmm. If you came from hardship, if your family came from hardship and you get to have choices in life that they never had, that's pretty interesting. Like, that's the magic of this country, which makes it so incredible. And when I was in third grade, I remember, thinking, I wanted to be an astronaut. And at the time, there hadn't been really astronauts in space, and that looked like me. And so it was a good reminder very quickly, like if you don't have a central casting, that's an issue. And, fast forward 2 years later, I'm like, hey, I'm going to go run for, student class president. I had just seen the 1988, Democratic, primary, interested in politics a little bit. And my mom, I remember her telling me, so this is what I'm, 8 years old. And she says, you got to be really careful here. They'll never think you're American. Just be careful. You should be trying to blend in, not trying to stand out. And so I said, okay, I'm going to go to my classroom. I'm going to put in my ballot. And one of the boys went up to me and said, no one's going to vote for you because, they think you eat dog. And I had a dog at home. I would never eat my pet. Like, it was just very weird. I never even heard of it. And I remember after lunchtime, after basketball, coming back, and there was a picture of me eating a dog on my desk. And like, you tell me, right? Like, Jerry, Grizz, when you're born in the world, do you think these things? Like, these things don't just happen. They're passed down. Right. Yeah. Right. So even at that age, I learned very quickly that there's some things like that people didn't think I could ever have. That is when you kind of realize the world is different from us. So once you realize the world treats you differently because of how you look, and that your choices change because of that, that is a really hard thing to acknowledge early in your life. But every person I'm sure you talk to have had those moments where they say, oh my gosh, this is really crummy. And then you sort of hopefully build resilience from it. But, I never even really absorbed what that meant till years later.
I was going to say, as an 8-year-old, how could you?
Yeah. You sort of I just sort of thought, I had it pretty good. I had, I played on the baseball team. I had lots of friends. I had ice cream cake for my birthday. Like, I was kind of rolling, that's kind of, that's how you're doing well. I'm in Boy Scouts. As sort of America as it gets in many ways. Right. And this is the thing, right? I still wasn't American enough, despite how I sound or the things I was interested in, and even today in the things I work on, right? There's still some of that, wow, you have such you use such big words. It's like, well, I use shorter words too. Thank you. I unfortunately, that's part of my personality though, is from what my mother told me, which was be careful. And it's true. There's in this country, there's this, sort of perspective that Asian Americans are some model group, right? And what happens is that's totally not true. That there are many Asian groups that, if you look at disaggregated data, there are Asians out there, Lao Americans, Vietnamese Americans we talked about earlier, that have lower GDP per capita in their home, that have lower access to healthcare, that have lower graduation rates from high school or college, have had more experiences in the criminal justice system, and have a lower life expectancy than groups that you would have pictured first. Right. So yes, there are some Asians that go to Harvard and work at McKinsey. Absolutely. There are a few of those. Absolutely. But if you tell that story that everyone is just like that, it's a little ridiculous, because what we were talking about earlier, you had Asian Americans here since the 19th century. And then you have my parents who arrived in the United States in 1981. Right. We can agree that those experiences might mean different things for their families. Right. Right. And that's the same in the European experience. Right. The waves of when you come here, where you settled, maybe even had an indicator of what happened. Right. Not just as a New Englander, but let's say you landed in the DC area. It would have a path dependency. For these groups, definitely there's definitely opportunity challenges right up front that, maybe have been discounted. And, maybe haven't been counted out in terms of how we view people.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that's a lack of education or what, but I do know that, just listening to people in conversation, because I've traveled a lot and, in the United States. And when people talk about Asian Americans or they see an Asian, the immediate assumption is they're Chinese or Japanese.
Mm-hmm.
And, then there's the mythology around those two cultures and their education system, which is part of where that comes from.
Yep.
And you don't hear a lot of people correcting that or talking about it. And it seems like until COVID happened, the debate around racism in America has kind of been ramping up. But from my perspective, it seems like the Asian cultures have largely been left out of that conversation until this has started ramping up here.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, if you look at the 60s, the term Asian American was something that was started as a political term. And really it was actually tied in some ways in solidarity. They used to call it yellow peril, and yellow peril would go in connection with Black Panthers and some of these other, more militant extremist groups. Right. But there was already that sort of understanding that when you think about the world of divide and conquer, right? The natural thing you want to do when you're on top is divide people, right? Because when you divide people, they're distracted from the real thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the model minority lie is a part of it. So what happens is not only does it perpetuate the fact that, all Asians are doing great and fine, but it also creates a wedge between Asian Americans and other groups, right? So that becomes a really interesting what happens is people sort of forget the medium and longer term histories, right? I think often about, Asians in other parts of the world and how, they're sort of necessaries in terms of the collaboration of economies. Like something people don't know, right? There was a ton of Chinese that moved to Cuba, and they're sort of a central part of the economy. There are tons of, Asians in West Africa who have a huge part of the economy. And Asians here in the US have a major role in that. But I think for the most part in these other countries, they're sort of separated. I think in the US context, right, I think initially it starts out as a separation. That's largely because of cultural ties. That's largely because of closer familial bonds, right? Usually what happens is somebody knows someone who goes there, you move there. But then over time, they're kids, right? Want to explore. They want to move to Connecticut. They want to, see new things. They want to work in shiny office jobs their parents wouldn't have had. And then suddenly you have people everywhere. But the histories don't go everywhere either, right? Mm. Those stories don't go with them. So it's really on the person to tell a story. But remember, these are folks who have been told very early on that they shouldn't rock the boat, that they shouldn't be saying too much. They should be happy to be here. Because like my parents, right, they came, after the fall of Saigon. So the communists took all their stuff, right? So they were a little distrustful of the big government, and they were a little distrustful of others getting in their stuff. I get that. But now, this is a time to be offering the opportunity to talk about life experiences. And the number one thing I tell people is either learn about the histories or talk to somebody about it. And I don't mean that in a way of talking to somebody about it and then, it's exhausting for them. But I find most Asian Americans, when you talk to them, if you ask them about their family history, they're probably surprised that you even care. Right. To be honest, it's not like the case. And I will say this among my Black friends who I talk to about this. When you talk about race issues with them, it's exhausting because it's a very different paradigm. But Asians, when you talk to them about their experiences, that's different because they're not even used to even mattering. Right. How many times do you see polling that says, this group thinks this group thinks that? There's no Asians on there, probably.
It's true.
Right? It's interesting, right?
That was kind of what I was what I was mentioning earlier when I said that you guys seem really left out of the conversation. Very
much so. Yeah, and it's interesting because if you look at the politics of the country, right, it's pretty divided, as you know, and much of these elections are decided usually plus or minus 3 or 4 points, right? Asian American Pacific Islanders make up 7% of the country. So you got to think, if you actually catered to a group that's never been catered to before, it actually could flip completely different political discourses, right? That's not normal. But because the districts are drawn in the ways they are, there's gonna be only a handful that are really close. And those are usually the places where there's wild cards. And Asian Americans are a total wild card because they're newer entrants in politics. right? And that's why for me, when my experience is working for the governor or working as a national security advisor for 2 members of Congress, I was usually the only Asian in a room, right? Because it was such a new thing. There were so few of us there. So it was very tough to sort of be represented in that way. It's changing. It's just moving pretty slowly. But if you think about like what matters, especially when you think about the economy or your communities, these folks are definitely important to how things work. They just aren't loud about it. Now they're starting to talk about it.
Mm.
Well, one thing to bring it fully around from your 8-year-old story, out of the 3 of us, I'm probably the only one here who's eaten dog, so we can see how that goes as far as racism.
Wait, you can't just drop this on that, Chris. I mean, what happened?
I've spent time in Korea, so
okay.
Korea is one of the few places that actually ate dogs.
Yeah. I wasn't sure if that was like a lost bet or something.
Oh God, no! In the States, that'd be a
brutal
bad
bet to make.
Yeah,
no shit.
The other one, in some countries is eating horse.
Yes, that's big in China, right? I believe.
In Mongolia and a few other places too. Yeah. But I don't know. I have a hard time thinking about that. Like, the horse is winning gold medals in the Olympics. Tying that back.
I think for Americans in general, a lot of times it's hard for us to picture other countries and what their beliefs are, and very rarely do we give them any sort of leniency to that. Could have been started thousands of years ago. Mm-hmm. And it's a tradition that's gone on. If you look at traditions in America, there are things we do that other countries look at us and go like heathens, like we're savages for that. Like, so you have to have a degree of acceptance when looking at all these things. Yeah. And just because you don't agree with it doesn't mean it's not okay in that other country.
Yeah, I mean, remember that the American experience is 400 years.
Yeah,
it's very short.
Which is baby.
Yeah, and it's tiny, right? Yep. I mean, you think about, the histories of China or, the United Kingdom or Australia or these places. I mean, they have very different lineages and histories. But what's interesting about America, and this is, the American story is really powerful because when we're at our best, we've taken our best from people of all stripes, right? Like, think about it, like if I use a sports analogy, right? I mean, if you're trying to build a team through the draft, wouldn't you be trying to draft for the best player on the board or the biggest need? You wouldn't care about anything else except those sort of skill sets, right? Yep. So why would you eliminate, I don't know, women from leadership roles? Why would you do it? It's 52% of the population. Why would you do that, right? Or why would you, not look at certain human capital? I mean, when I think about, this is something I talk to you about with companies is, companies have a really important role in trying to create a workforce that is representative in the 21st century. And that's not because of the goodness of their hearts. It's so that they can be competitive on the global stage because, and I'm sure you all have experienced this in your professional lives, groupthink is a killer. Like imagine if you have everyone from the same school, from the same school of thought, from the same place, same problems, same solutions, right?
We've been doing it this way for years. Yeah.
How many times have you heard that, right?
Oh, yeah.
It's not exactly innovative. In some of my previous roles was dealing with cybersecurity. So you had really big bad guys coming into systems. You know who the best people were in fighting the bad guys? It wasn't the Ivy League kids. It wasn't the folks with the great certifications. It was the people who had non-traditional backgrounds. Mm-hmm. Got into a little bit of trouble. They were the folks that, took things apart and put it back together, didn't do super well in school because they were bored.
Yep.
They went through probably community college or went through a local public school. And they're the ones that could take on the bad guys because they think so differently. They've had such different life experience. They're so creative and they have grit. Right. And that's something I think about from a casting perspective. I'm not trying to check boxes. For me, it's like, listen, do you have a workforce that only sees things this way? Because if you do, you're going to lose every time, right? Because the competition is a global sport, right? Why would you draft 50 wide receivers, right? You would be trying to get people with different, unique skills for the team need, right? That makes the best team, right? And you're going to need some superstars that do certain things, but you still need superstars to throw the ball to somebody who's really good at running the ball. Right. So this is something I talk about with companies. It does resonate to them, but isn't resonating fast enough. Right. You'll hear people talk about, there isn't this many group of people that you can find, but it's largely because they're tapping their quote unquote network, and their quote unquote network is their same buddies from their same places, right? That's not a real search. What it is like, that'd be like me telling you, hey, I need some money. And you'll look in your couch the third time. There probably ain't too much change in there, right? So this is something I think we do have opportunities to search and do better. And that's beyond sort of a racism thing. This is just a common sense thing. This is if you want to compete with the big players, you got to leverage all of America's talents, and all of America's talents come from widely different places. But we'll put in requirements on X and Y that have no reason for it. They're essentially just done so you can eliminate people so that you don't have to think creatively. You
need a master's and 18 years of experience.
Who cares? Who cares? Can you do the job? Yes, no, right? Like, are you passionate about this work? Like, it's so hard to find. It's hard enough to find amazing people for jobs that they're passionate about. Especially in this pandemic, right? I guarantee you will have a wave of people all quitting their jobs after all this, because people came to the conclusion, life is too short. They're like, listen, I want to do this thing. I've never gotten the chance to do it. All these people died. I want to see the world, or I want to do the thing I've always wanted to do. Right. Yeah. I want to chase my dream instead of chase my compromise. Right. Yeah. I think you're going to see that, and you're seeing that in the openings and availabilities. You're seeing that in wages. You're seeing that all across the board. And part of it is this recognition that the way of doing things before cannot be the way we're doing things now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting how the pandemic's kind of opened up all these new things that we were not thinking about a year and a half ago, or 2 years ago, or whatever it was.
Yeah.
I was thinking today that because I have actually made decisions on similar premise. It was before the pandemic. I started doing stuff I wanted to do because I actually have an immune disorder, which that's what changed my perspective.
Yeah.
But I think that this has opened up America's eyes, not just to the fact that people want to do what they want to do because they've realized how limited time is here on Earth. But it's also opened our eyes to just how many jobs exist that only exist for the sake of their existence. They don't really serve a purpose. Mm-hmm. And a lot of those jobs, they were either laid off or drastically reduced the amount of work they were doing because of COVID. And things kept working just fine for a lot of places that it happened to.
Yeah. I mean, at the same time, though, right? So that's one end, right? And at the same time, you had people, essential workers, right? People that take care of your kids, right? For daycare, who are paid like $12 an hour. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. So like, imagine that, right? Or people that are serving you at the restaurant or the bar. These are folks that are interfacing with you daily, and they're the ones dealing with significant hardship. And are dealing with, frankly, some of the stress related. Like, I have friends who are in the service industry that daily have to deal with somebody that is adamant that they won't wear a mask, or they're so like anti this and anti freedom. And
I could never be in that service. Nope.
Create a scene, right? Yeah. What I tell folks, I tell folks, listen, if you want to learn about humility, like, wait tables. Right.
Nope. I'd be in jail.
Yeah. Well, I think if everyone had a service job early, I think we'd have much better people.
Yeah, I agree. Like, you got to work with people, but at the same time, there are things like I could never work in the medical field. I'm sorry. I'd be fired. Like, right off the bat.
Yeah. And so this is something I think about, right? Like, why is it that we pay teachers what they pay, even though they're probably dealing with, potential infection for kids who may or may not be wearing masks, who may not be protected? It's a pretty interesting question. Like, if you think about we put value into certain things, we say, oh, this CEO is very valuable. But then we think of like the school teacher. Well, they're really valuable, but we pay them nothing. And we're somehow okay with that.
We just talked about this 2 weeks ago. Like, how are you ever going to pull in someone who's the best at teaching if you're going to pay them shit?
You're not. They're going to end up working at some ed tech company.
Yeah.
Right. And that's what happens. Like, people go into that, or they move on from education to another field because it's just not. It's not a living wage, right?
No,
and it's not a lifestyle thing. This is just a quality of life thing. Right. And that's crushing, because who's educating your kids at that point?
I have a buddy of mine who's a high school teacher, and he has to have a second job as construction just to pay his bills. So he literally leaves work or leaves the school at 3 and goes to construction till 9 at night. Like, what? No. And on top of that, anyone who knows a teacher puts in a shit ton of extra hours that they are not getting paid for.
And they're also being expected to buy supplies that they're not compensated for, right? All the nights that they're grading or providing feedback to teachers, or the kids that are behind or have a special need, right? That's all, as one of my old bosses used to say, in some careers you're paid with karma. You're not paid in dollars. And teaching is unfortunately a big part. Like, I mean, from a math perspective, why does your friend just not do construction full time? Because if your friend did construction full time, probably make double.
He would, but again, he loves teaching the kids. So that's that's the part of it.
And those are the teachers we want, but we should be putting them in a position where they don't have to go do another job.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, the three of us are in some shiny office job, right? Like, you know what I mean? It's like, and I don't get me wrong. I think the three of us do real work, but in the big picture, I would think are educators who are taking care of little Timmy, right? Little Timmy's going to grow up to be big Timmy. We want Timmy to have a sense of the world and have morality and these other things, right? Yep. And the skills to compete in the 21st century.
Yeah, I mean, listen, there are a lot of fields that are not getting paid nearly what the medical field is one of them. I mean, all right, fine, the doctors make a shit ton of money, but people don't realize there's a lot of people underneath the nurses and doctors that are barely making over minimum wage. And they're doing, I mean, you've probably called them nurses before because you thought they were one. Yeah. And yet they're making $10 an hour, $12 an hour.
Yeah, and they're again in very stressful environments, right? Like I don't know if you're seeing the news, but Austin, Texas, right, has only 6 ICU beds left. So imagine the strain that they when you go take care of your patient, you're not just dealing with the patient, you're dealing with the families, right? You're dealing with the uncertainty, and heaven forbid the person passes away, like the weight of that. So these are things I think about, right? Like in terms of equity. And I don't mean like everyone is treated, everyone deserves everything. That's what I'm saying. I'm just saying that, similar to the American dream, everyone deserves shots. And I just think, from what you're seeing, like certain people are not getting their fair shake here. Right. And it's certainly not because they're not trying. And I think in America, for whatever reason, we still have a culture that looks at hardship as it's your fault, rather than maybe saying, were there other circumstances? I don't know, like a global pandemic or other things, right, that affected your trajectory, right? Think about, like, again, if I use the sports analogy, right? Think about like someone with amazing potential, right? And they have a torn ACL through no fault of their own, right? They never live up to what they were supposed to do. Is it their fault? I don't think so. Right? These things happen, right? Like there's certain things that happen that it makes you wonder, like how much of it is in your control versus how much of it is in other factors' control. And I think we need to be doing a better job maximizing this part of what we do control, and that's namely about providing opportunity, being thoughtful of how we approach others, acknowledging that we have some shortcomings, and then trying to find creative ways to do it. Because otherwise, you and I are just reading 2,700 pages of stuff we don't understand, right? And that's huge challenges. And my hope is that we can convince others to take. It's not about the big steps; it's about the little things, right? Like that's really the difference. It's the three of us having this conversation. It's about talking to that uncle of yours at Thanksgiving who says kind of racist stuff and being like, "Yo, that's not cool." Right. Yeah. It's talking to a friend of yours to share their immigrant family story, regardless of where they're from. Like everyone's got one. It's, being able to talk to people about, where their shortcomings are in work and helping them figure out what their next thing is. It's like the little things that advice is, you get what you pay for. It's free. But I'd like to think that the three of us have an interest and a passion in helping others and making sure that we can do our part to make the world a little bit of a better place.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, Jeff, that was very well said, and we really appreciate you being on the show. This is a fantastic conversation, and I hope that our listeners get a lot out of this.
Hey, thanks for having me, Jerry, and I'm looking forward to being on and giving you more shit later, okay?
All right, thank you.
Thanks, man.
Woo! Riz, that was a hell of an episode, wasn't it?
Yeah, man. We're a bunch of dumb monkeys. We're always learning new things.
Yeah, I actually learned more than I thought I was going to with this episode. And I didn't even know I had the questions I had until we started talking to Jeff. It kind of it sparked a lot of thoughts in my head.
Yeah, I mean, Jeff kind of had a hard exit for us, but I could have gone on with that one for a while. Like, I wanted to ask him more about his parents coming over from Vietnam. Like, yeah,
that's an interesting story. And actually, if you guys liked him, he is more than willing to be on again, talk about his parents, or really whatever we wanted. He didn't say specifically what he would talk about.
No, he didn't.
He just liked hanging out with us.
Yeah, the idea of the whole, coming over from Vietnam right after the war, like, that's some crazy shit.
Especially because they lived on a boat for 6 years. That's a wild ride.
That's not that shocking.
It's not shocking, but it is a fucked up situation.
Oh, fuck yeah.
But yeah, I liked that conversation a lot. And I'm pretty sure you guys are going to like it too, or did like it since you're here now.
Yep. Jerry's a stupid monkey.
Yes, I am.
Thank you again for listening to Beautiful Bastards. Remember to like and subscribe. Check us out every Monday. The dudes are merging.
Oh, I'm supposed to have a quote. In the practice of tolerance, one's enemy is the best teacher.
I told you, he's a dumb monkey.
See you next week. Bye.
Later.